Alright, in a previous video I showed how to build this flow that will take a uh, form submission to a personally owned Microsoft form with a file upload attachment and send that file to SharePoint, and I did another one where we also sent it as an email attachment. And what we're going to do is basically modify this because some folks have said, well, what happens when your file upload question on the form is not required? And there are certainly cases where you'll have a form and there'll be a file upload question that is not required. Say it's a form where they're reporting an issue with a with a product or with a facility, and you want them to be able to attach photos, but they're not always going to attach a photo. So what will we do in those situations? Now, if you use the flow as I've shown them before, the flow will fail because it's always looking for that form, that question on the form, to have some data there. And if there is no data, then it will fail. So what we're going to do is talk about how we address that, how we can take a form where you may or may not have a file upload on the form, or I should say where the person filling out the form may or may not attach a file, and how can we still have that flow finish. In our case, we're going to send an email. So in this case, this is personal form file upload to SharePoint. We're going to change it around and send it to an email instead. But since I have most of the work done here, if I look at this flow, this has most of what I need. It's getting a form response, it's getting the details, it's getting the user profile, it's parsing JSON to get the data, making up the response data to that file upload question. So this has most of what we want. So what we're going to do is just use this as a base, and this is a trick that I've used, not trick, but a feature that I've used quite a bit for kind of making, taking one flow and reusing it somewhere else, or modifying it in some way for a specific case. Basically, when you're on this flow details page, click Save As, and you have the option of saving that flow, saving a new copy of that flow with a new name. So I'm going to call this demo personal form file upload. I'll just say to email, and I'll say conditional, because if we have a file, we're going to attach that file. If we don't, then we're not, but we need to show how to do that. Alright, so let's give this a moment to create. Now, when you do that file save as, it brings you back to the original form, or the original flow rather. So don't jump in here and start making edits because you're still working on the source one, unless that's what you intend to do. What I'm going to do is click on flows to go back to my home page, or the My Flows page, and there's our new sorry, keep saying that. Our new flow, and you'll see that it is turned off by default. This is basically so that the flow won't immediately start being used unless you want it to be used. So you, at a minimum, if you wanted to use this as is, you would need to come in here and turn it on. In our case, we want to edit it first to show how to make it do what we want to do. So for right now, what I'm going to do is actually we are going to turn this on, and we are going to run it just so we can see where the flow fails, so we know what we need to do to address that. So I've just turned it on, and then I'm going to go over to the form that is triggering that flow. So let me preview this, and I'll say no file attached, submit, and there we go. So now if we jump in and look at the runs for this, there is a flow run that failed. Let's see where it failed. And it's specifically the parse JSON step here that failed. And it's because it requires a value or expects a value but got null. So if there's no data there for that parse JSON step to parse, then it will fail. So now we know that's where it's going to fail, and we know we need to somehow intercept that, provide a way, some error handling. So what should the flow do if that step fails? Because we still want it to, at the end of the day, send the email. In this case, we're going to send an email, but whatever you want the flow to do, point is you don't want it to fail when there is no file attached, because the file may not be required. So let's go into edit mode here. And a couple of things we're going to need to do. The first is to create some variables. Now, we're going to create 3 variables. The first is going to be for the email subject. Second is going to be for the email body, because we want to populate that based on whether they attached a file or not, because in certain cases you want to be able to adjust that as appropriate. And then we're also going to create a variable for an array variable to hold the file attachment. So when there are file attachments, we need to be able to include those, and the way we do that is to put them into an array. So I'm going to add an action here, and it will be initialize variable. And just to save myself some time, I'm going to copy that to my clipboard, and we'll call this var subject, and that will be a string variable. Rename this to var subject, and then we will add another action. And now simply, instead of searching for that, I can just go to my clipboard and say initialize variable. In this case, we will call it var body for the email body, and again, that's going to be string. And again, we'll rename it just to keep things consistent. And then finally, we will add one more variable, initialize one more variable. Now, in this case, it's going to be var attachments, and it will be an array, because as I stated in previous videos, whenever that file use that file upload question, even if you are limiting them to limiting the user of the form to submitting or attaching a single file, it is still being handled as or presented as an array. So you need to account for that. So this is going to be an array variable. Also, when we want to attach that to an email, we need it in an array variable, because again, emails can have multiple attachments. I mean, technically you don't need it as an array, but it's going to help us out to have that as an array. And let me just rename this var attachments. Okay, so now we have our variables, and the next thing we're going to do is, okay, so we know that this parse JSON failed, and that's what caused the entire flow to fail. So when any step in the flow fails, all of the subsequent steps will fail as well. However, there is a property or setting for all of these actions called configure run after that allows you to specify what should happen if a step fails. And we're going to use that here to basically say, if this step fails, and it's going to fail because there are no attachments, then, if it fails, then we're going to basically set those subject and body variables to say there are no files attached. However, if this doesn't fail, then we want the subsequent step to put those values, or to then take the output of that parse JSON and build the variable array, the array variable for our attachments. All right, so the first thing we need to do is add a scope. You don't have to add a scope, it's just going to make our lives a lot easier. Actually, you probably do need to add a scope. Now that I think about it, I can't think of a way to do this without a scope. And if you haven't used a scope before in Power Automate, it's essentially a container. The nice thing is that when you create a scope, and I'll just rename this to, actually I'm going to leave the name as scope right now, because within this scope, as I said, it's a container, but it's one of the properties or one of the capabilities that scopes give us is to say, essentially treat all of the steps inside as one object. So if any one of those steps fails or is skipped, then the scope itself is going to be skipped. So it just gives us a way to kind of lump together or organize our flows into these stages or modules so that we can handle things a little bit better. So within here, I'm going to add some set variable actions. So I'll add a set variable, and again, just to save ourselves a little time, I will copy that. So in this case, we're going to set the var subject. Oh, somehow I used the wrong letter there. So var body. Okay, there we go. So we're going to set var subject, and then we're also going to copy that. Let me add another action. Set variable. In this case, we're going to set the body. So let me just rename these to set variable var subject. And you can use whatever naming convention you want for these. I've just found this to be the most convenient for me to remember and consistent, and consistency is important when you're building things like this. So now I've got a scope with two set variable actions where I'm setting the subject and the body, and I haven't set any values for those because what I want to do is copy this whole scope. Now once I've got that copied, I'm going to create a duplicate of it, but let me first rename these. So we'll call this scope no files attached, and then in the subject we'll say no files subject, and in the body we'll say no files body. Again, this can be whatever text you want. I'm just throwing very simple text in there for right now. All right, so now we need to add another scope, or I should say a duplicate of that. So we'll add an action, go to the clipboard and add that scope. This one we're going to call yes files attached. And then within there we've got those same things, but now we're going to say the subject is yes files are attached, or we'll just say files attached subject, just to match up with the previous one there. And this will be files attached body. All right. So that's that. Now, if there are files attached, we need to put them into a variable, and this is something I showed in another video. So I'm going to pause recording here and just pop in the step that we need to do that. So give me just a moment. Okay, so what I've done is, and again in another video I show how to build this apply to each that gets the file metadata, gets the file content based on the output of that parse JSON action, and then appends it into the array variable using this format of name and the file name, and the content bytes and the file content. So again, see the other videos. I don't want to walk through all of that again. So this is going to build that attachments variable, which we can then use to send the emails or send the files as an email attachment. So next step I would want to do is add an email action. So we're going to use send email from a shared mailbox. I have a shared mailbox here called SPO test mailbox, and we're going to send that to the mail value from the get user profile action. So we know that that's the valid email address for the user. And then the subject, remember, this is why we set those variables for the subject and the body, because we want this to, if they attach a file, we want one subject. If they don't, we want it to be something else. So that's why we have those scopes. So here we just need to simply plug in var subject and then var body. Now, obviously, you can include other text in here if you have some kind of standard text you want to appear regardless of whether there is an attachment or not. But that's that. So we're just going to leave it as that. Now, because we haven't actually, all we've done so far is just add the ability to, or given ourselves some options of how to handle this parse JSON failing. And I mentioned that we were going to use the configure run after option. So let's talk about that a little bit. So essentially we have the parse JSON, which we know is going to fail. So what we want to do is say, if that fails, we still want this scope to run to build out the subject and body variables. So what we need to do is click the three dots here for this scope and say configure run after. And we want to run this only in this situation where parse JSON fails. So if parse JSON works, if there is an attachment and it works, then this step will be, this scope is going to be skipped. Only when it fails will this actually come into play. Now, similarly, if this is skipped, if we were to leave it as is, then essentially this is going to skip. Oh, if this fails, it fails. If this doesn't fail, it skips. It's basically, we need to also say to this scope, okay, if the previous scope fails, or I'm sorry, if the previous scope is skipped, not as successful, but is skipped. So essentially, if there is an attachment, then this is going to be, this will be successful, this will be skipped, so this scope will run. If there is no attachment, this will fail, this one will run. So that brings us to, we'll click done. Now the last thing we want to do is basically say, for this step, if we want this email to be sent regardless of whether this step is successful or is skipped. The default run after, so if we click configure run after, we'll see that the only option is successful. So if there are files attached, this is going to work perfectly fine. However, if it's not, because this step will not even fire, or this step will be skipped, the email won't send. So what we need to do is say send this email whether that previous step or that previous scope that files are attached is either successful or is skipped. And then actually one last thing we need to do is actually add that attachment array to our attachments. Alright, so that all looks good to me. Let's save this and then we will give it a try. The first thing we're going to do is actually, well, we can't try it because I've added that Outlook step. So let's just try it again, submitting another response, and I'll just say still no file. Submit that. And now if we look at that flow run, we'll see that it is running and it succeeded. And I will have gotten an email. So I look at my Outlook email. Actually, it's going to a shared mailbox, so I can't bring that up here. But we know that even looking at the flow run, we can see parse JSON failed, no files attached ran, yes files attached was skipped, and send an email worked. And we can see it's got no file subject, no files body. All right, so we know it works when there are no files. Let's see what happens if we attach a file. We'll say, okay, here's a file, upload a file, and I'll just grab some random Word document I've got there and submit that and refresh this. We'll see this flow is running and we'll see that it succeeded. And in this case, we'll see that parse JSON was successful. So no files attached was skipped. Yes files attached ran. And in our send email from shared mailbox, we'll see files attached subject. And then we can see, hey, there were the attachments. So success. Now there are absolutely half a dozen other ways you could do this, using conditions, using switch cases, and other things. This is what I found to be, in this particular circumstance, the simplest way to do it. It's just leveraging that configure run after option. And then if you find another way works better for you, absolutely use whatever works for you. But this is what I have found to work fine for me. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below, and thank you for your time.